very welcome. We're just going to acknowledge the land that we're on, and I borrowed this from Theatre Calgary. This is their version. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and create on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Kainai, and the Piikani nations, the Tsuut'ina, the Iahe Nakota nations, the Métis homeland, Districts 5 and 6, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. They were the original occupants of this land and continue to be here to this day. St. Thomas is grateful to have the opportunity to share this territory. And now, here's Sandra.
Well, what a treat to be here. I'm very grateful to see all these faces, and I really acknowledge that you could be doing something else on a nice Sunday in June, so thank you for staying. And it was Annette, when I was getting coffee, I was admiring her ribbon skirt, and I brought one, and she said, well, why don't you put yours on? So I did. I'm going to refer to it, so I'll show you. And these are their box. And it came from Moose Lake, Manitoba, near where I'm from. Anybody Manitoba here? Where from? That is loud enough. Thank you, Tracy, for a lovely service. I really appreciated being here. There's a warmth and a almost palpable acceptance that you feel when you walk into this sanctuary. And I experienced that, and you create it, so thank you. And Elaine, thank you for getting me here. Elaine and I and Tracy have worked in the right relations area of Calgary and the United Churches for a long time. So 10 years ago we met, maybe, about. And Elaine, too, and I go to Hillhurst United. And we started some right relations things there about 10 years ago. And we invited all the churches to come to Hillhurst because there weren't many of us at that point. And so we were finding strength in numbers, and it was, those were exciting times when we were getting ready to, I guess, be a little more public about what right relations meant to us. And I was thinking about what to say and to you folks gathered here. And I was aware that we all have a different path of reconciliation and or a different path of our experience with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. And what you're going to hear about today is my personal journey of reconciliation. And my work as a therapist, I get quite dry when I'm talking, so I'll stop and take a drink every so often. My work as a psychotherapist has taken me to many Indigenous communities, and I'm almost 77, and maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I began to wonder, as I was slowing down in my work, why I had worked primarily in Indigenous communities. And what did that mean? And I began looking at my own prejudices and my own racist thoughts and ideas. And as that grew, I began writing. And the memoir that I'm going to talk about today, Crossing the River, I just published a while ago, and it was really a story of me struggling with what it was like to be a white settler woman and to have grown up in a community in northern Manitoba, a place called the Paw. Anyone heard of it? I'm sure you have. And to have experienced in that community a murder of a woman called Helen Betty Osborne. Anyone heard of that murder? That murder happened when I lived there, and two of the accused were men I went to school with. And that also compelled me to say that the two men that I knew well, I knew all four of them, but the two men I knew well were involved in the United Church in the Paw. One's mom was the organist, and the other mom was the head of the UCW. And they were in our home, and we were in their home. And I began to, because of course the murder was brutal and shocked everyone and caused great terror in the Indigenous women in our community. And I began to wonder, well, if they were raised in this little town in what I thought might be a similar way to me, what did that say about me? So I began writing, and I don't know if any of you have ever been compelled by something you don't quite understand. But as time went on, and I wrote and wrote and wrote, I had this compelling feeling that I had to finish something. I'm not sure I knew what I was finishing. I'm not sure I knew what I was really writing about, but I was writing about this kind of juxtaposition, this incongruency in being a white settler woman who had grown up in a community that was racist. And I began to see myself in that light. I began to realize I too carried a whole lot of racist thoughts and a whole lot of racist ideas. And so time went on, and I continued to write. I was never planning to publish the book. I thought at best I might publish something or have some photocopies made for my family. And then I did a great and a difficult thing. I hired an editor. And I don't know if anyone knows Carolyn Pogue, whose husband was our moderator, Bill Phipps. So she's an editor, and we're friends. She and my husband are friends with Carolyn and Bill. And she's kind of a brutal editor. She wouldn't let me away with anything. So, one of the things I did in the writing of the book was that I wrote very judgmentally about the community where I was raised, and about the murder, and about these young men. I mean, it was, those are in a pile to throw away. But that was part of my writing. And I was, as I say, compelled to keep writing. And at one point, Carolyn, whom I'd at that point hired as my editor, and it happened, we did a lot of work during COVID online, and we met twice a month. Every 2 weeks, I had to have a chapter for her. Oh, it was hard work, but in the end, it was good. And I remember at one point submitting to her the week before we met the story about my feelings toward growing up in the Paw and toward the families and the men that were involved in the brutal murder. At one point, Carolyn, on screen, looked at me and said, "Sandra, do you realize you are the Paw, and you better dig a little deeper?" Well, that set me back. And of course got me thinking. I trusted her. There was more for me to explore and more for me to understand. And what I came to eventually in that story was that there were many, many, many communities in Canada that carry racist and prejudicial views. And there were many, many murdered and Indigenous women all over Canada. And I had only the paw as my kind of touchstone and target. And so I had to widen the picture in my mind and began to see myself in the story and how complicit in some ways I was in that story. And that was hard work, and that's really what the book's about. Hi, welcome.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
Sorry.
You just came from Foothills?
Yes.
Yeah. Welcome. I'm Sandra. Nice to have you here. So the book came out of those struggles. Carolyn, from the beginning, was insistent that I was going to publish this. I was not. It became a very vulnerable book. I went back to the paw many times. I still do. But I went back to the paw in the last 10 years, specifically to talk to some of the people I'd worked with, worked for, finding, kind of my own way in the story of my own racism and in my own prejudice. And she always thought someone else is going to benefit from this story. I didn't really care, quite frankly. I needed to reconcile with me. Does that make sense? There was so much uncertainty in me about why I had focused my career as a psychotherapist in Indigenous communities, and then why I had questioned that. So I'll tell you one very short story, and then I'll read something out of my book. About 20 years ago, when I was practicing in Williams Lake, BC, with the Chilcotin and the Shuswap people, I went to a workshop, a training workshop, that was offered to Indigenous and non-Indigenous therapists. And we were learning a technique to work with survivors of residential school. And it was role-playing, psychodrama. Maybe people are familiar with that. And during the workshop, when people were talking, the Indigenous therapists were talking about their own experience, I had a sudden awakening, and I remembered that I had been involved in the paw when I was first hired, first out of university and ready to, change the world because I was so smart and brilliant, and far more brilliant than the Indigenous people that I worked with. I remembered that I had been involved in supporting the removal of children to residential school, and I had completely forgotten. And I sat in this workshop and wept and thought I'd leave. I've written that story in my book, a little bit more detail. And finally, I went and talked to an elder because I was a mess, and told him my story. His name is Charlie. I found him last year. He gave me an eagle feather, forgave me, and thanked me. Can you imagine? I had to write about that. It was a little hard to write through some of my tears, but that is a part of my book, places where I found reconciliation by looking for and finding people that I thought I needed to do some work with. I think I'll read a piece and then might talk a little more and then ask if you would like to ask some questions or make some comments. Sound okay so far? We were thinking that we would be here about an hour. I don't even know what time it is. Are people okay with an hour? Like till what, would that be 1:15 or something? Make sure and stop me because I might go over. This is at the, close to the beginning of my book. Come and sit with me a while, and I will tell you a story of a country that went wrong. Come, sit with me a while, and I'll tell you how I too went wrong. My silence and embedded racism added weight to the crushing burden of oppression and the dehumanization of many people. Come, sit with me a while as the elders have taught me, as I meander my way through the broken glass of privilege and pain, arrogance and fear. Shards will cut me and you, because racism cuts twice. The inflicted and the inflictor pay. I learned within a system where white was right and conquering was required. Listening was never encouraged. Come and sit with me a while and help me turn upside down the belief that we were the strong ones, pioneers who populated this wild country. It needed taming with a steel railroad track. The track sliced through lives, lands, and hearts. Come and sit with me a while and learn about the old country that we came to, where for millennia the first peoples lived out their lives never once thinking that respecting the land and the animals and the water would be labeled savage and godless. Come and sit with me a while, and I'll tell you how my Scottish grandfather looked strong, standing on the back of the first peoples who befriended him, who felt compassion for this white face, who knew nothing of surviving a Canadian winter. Come and sit with me as I search for truth and honesty in my life and begin the necessary learning of being an ally. Come, sit with me a while. Maybe my story will open a doorway to you. One of the things that I thought would be interesting for folks to know, and I suspect quite a few of you do know, is that the United Church was and still is involved in right relations, in walking a reconciliation road, in trying to live out the 94 calls to action that were given to us by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And one of the things that I did, and it was for sure the most powerful volunteer work I had ever done, and that was to attend on behalf of the United Church hearings. Did anyone in this church community do that? You did, Tracy. Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. And so we were trained. For me, it was kind of light training because I didn't know how to pray on the spot, and ministers kind of do. But we were trained in some ways. I was in Manitoba then, living in Winnipeg, and we were to attend hearings where the claimants were telling their story to an adjudicator and a Canadian government lawyer and family members if they were there as well. And if the church was invited, we were party. The United Church was party to all the hearings because we ran residential schools, and we were part of the settlement, the financial settlement. So we were party to the hearings, but we'd been taught, as I'm sure you were, Tracy, that if the claimant didn't want us there, and who would want the abuser in the courtroom? Not courtroom, in the hearing. But many were willing. Now, I'm exaggerating a bit when I say abuser, but I saw myself as part of the process, even though it wasn't me and it wasn't my grandfather and it wasn't my cousin that was involved in the residential school, but it was my church. So I was there on behalf of the church to offer apology face-to-face, verbally. And we were supposed to figure out how to pray or say something really wise. And as a psychotherapist, I'd listened to many, many stories of abuse, not just from residential school, but from all ways, and worked primarily with abuse in my career. But it was an entirely different thing to sit in those hearings and realize it was my church. You know, I didn't have any objectivity that you kind of have as a therapist. So after the stories were given by the claimants in these hearings, then we would always ask the claimant, would they like us to speak? And in the 14 hearings that I was in, I think all but one wanted some words. So then you just kind of got to think on your feet. It wasn't hard to relate to the stories. What was hard to say was a prayer that would have some significance of taking responsibility for what happened on behalf of my church. That was a big step, wasn't it, Tracy? And we were part of that. And we showed up at hearings over and over and over. And several of the other churches did. Presbyterian, Anglican, the Catholic Church did not go to hearings. They missed an opportunity, in my opinion, for some kind of reconciliation possibility. Because when you hear the stories, you can't forget what we were involved in. So I thought I might read one of those stories as well later. Where are people at? Would people like to ask some questions now? I'd love to hear anything you might want to say about your experiences or mine. You can ask me. No questions are wrong. And I can also read again. Sure. Please tell us your name, even though probably everybody knows you.
No one knows me.
Okay.
Stuart, Miller. I had a lot of bias about Catholicism growing up, and I still do, but we listened to Pope Francis and speak when we were in Rome, and also listened to some of his words and what he's done in terms of actions. And I'm still working on that. Just wondered, how do you not sit with the United Church thinking about hierarchies in religion? Just curious.
Can you ask me again, how do I feel about the...
I sometimes sit with this bias of working with colleagues who are Catholic, who are beyond loving with their patients, and looking at school systems that are separate, and trying to sort of work on that part of things, of thinking how we're all in this together, or how can we all be in this together.
There's such a separation? Yeah.
What was that comment?
Sorry, how we can all be working together when there's such a separation. And then within the Catholic Church too, that hierarchy, right, of where we might not necessarily have that in the United Church.
It's a tough thing for me to figure out.
It's Richard? Stuart. Sorry. But you're going to be Stuart today. I think my most honest answer is I have the same question. I mean, working together for me has meant working, talking, and being in relationship with Indigenous people who have guided me in what works for them. But I get many answers about what that is. But I remember, and some of you would know this, I remember our church moderator now, Carmen Lansdowne, is that her name? Yeah. And another Indigenous man saying, you have to tell your own story. You have to look at your own journey and your own kind of heart and soul in all of this and make your way forward. We can't keep teaching you how to do it, but I have been taught over and over again by elders, and the whole church thing is complex because churches are complex and we were complicit, absolutely no other way of looking at it. When I lived and worked in Williams Lake for 20 years, right beside the community is a place called St. Joseph's Mission, and they were responsible for probably every Indigenous family around there being affected by generational trauma. I don't think there was a family there that was unaffected. And my husband would he sometimes said to me, "You got to stop being angry at the Catholic Church because, the United Church is no hero either." And so he sometimes brings me a balanced view. I'm probably not anywhere close to commenting on your question, Stuart, but it's a good one. Do you have any other comments? Don't be shy. Okay, thank you. Anyone else with a question or comment? One of the things that's happened when what I think is I put my psyche on paper was therapeutic for me, and it helped me drop some of the guilt. I think I've carried guilt for maybe most of my life. Maybe it was, I don't know, in my genetic makeup or something. But I know that when I began exploring more of this and realizing what I had been involved in without knowing, and interesting what your sermon said, the title of your sermon this morning, What We Don't Know. Am I right about that? Yeah. I found so much guilt when I looked at all of that. And, some of the elders I spoke to, and, I wrote some stories about that in my book, basically said, your guilt is no use to us. Move on, give it up. And one of the knowledge keepers in the PAW, when I went back with my book, I really felt I had to take the book home first. He said to me, "I'll just call you Guilt Sandra." He was pretty funny. We were on the radio one morning at the PAW, and he said, well, on the radio, he said to the announcer, "Oh, this is Guilt Sandra, and I'm Edwin." But I know that that was important for me to know and to drop or let go of, and to move into areas where it was actually reconciling, that there was actually some movement forward. Because guilt stops you in your tracks, and I think it did for me as well. Would you like me to read again? I have a few books here, and where's the gentleman that was going to look after the books? There you are. So they're on the table back there if you're interested. Oh, I did want to say about the book. So when I went back to the PAW with the book, the knowledge keeper who called me Guilt Sandra suggested that I consider a scholarship a bursary actually, at the University College of the North in the PAW. And so any of the proceeds, I mean, people who write don't write because they're going to be wealthy. They write because they're compelled, I think, or at least that's what happened to me. And so I'm taking a portion of the proceeds and I'm sending them to the PAW for a student involved in reconciliation. So that really pleased me that he suggested it. He said, well, my mother did that, and so did my cousin. And I said, great idea. And he is the first Indigenous chancellor of the University College of the North in the PAW. Great man. And helped me with my book a lot. Helped me with the title. So I don't know if you can see the cover, but there's a big bridge. And I lived on one side of the river because I was a white settler. And on the other side of the river was Opaskwayak Cree Nation. We didn't mix when I was growing up, and I didn't go to the reserve. And the bridge divided us. So I think it might have been Edwin. I had maybe 50 titles for my book, but I think it might have been him who said something about going across the bridge. So we got a picture of the bridge, and my publisher did that, and that's why it's called Crossing the River. So you're probably crossing some things yourself as you listen to me right now. I don't know what that is, but perhaps you are. So this is a hearing that I attended in 2007. Wow, that's a long time ago. One early, dark, and cold February morning in the winter of 2007, I climbed into a small plane at the Winnipeg airstrip and flew north to a First Nations community where the United Church had once operated a residential school. The adjudicator for the hearings and the claimant's lawyer were also on board. When we landed, we were met by one of the band's health committee members. We drove to the claimant's house where she had requested that the hearing take place. The claimant can always choose the location of their hearing. I waited in the vehicle and the others went in, and soon the lawyer returned to tell me the claimant didn't want me to attend. It was always the prerogative of the claimant to change their mind about who could listen. The stories were raw, and my church was complicit. We had been prepared to be asked to leave. I began to think about where I would go and wait, and just then the front door opened again, and the lawyer walked down the step. The claimant had changed her mind. What unfolded was the most compelling of all the hearings I attended. Sitting around the claimant's table with her husband beside her, we heard a story of horrific cruelty, betrayal, and abuse. We were all riveted by her quiet, steady voice and straightforward story of pain. At the end, when the lawyers and the adjudicator finished, the claimant asked, would I speak? She listened intently to every word I said, as I told her she had done nothing to deserve the abuse, that it was not her fault, and on behalf of the church, I was profoundly sorry for the pain and the trauma that she had experienced that had deeply affected her whole life. I read the church's 1986 apology to her and then gave her a copy in Cree. By this time, the claimant and I were crying. There was silence for quite a while around that table. Then her response astounded me. In a halting voice, she said, I can't believe you came here. The church flew you all the way here to say sorry? Just to me? She put her head down on her arms and wept. By then, most of us around the table were also crying. Lifting her head, she said, thank you. Thank you. I accept your apology. It means more to me than anything else we are doing here." In her steady, soft voice, she brought grace into that little kitchen, and I knew without a doubt that I was the one transformed by forgiveness received from a woman deeply betrayed by my own church. Apology, heartfelt, changed us both. How are we doing for time? So we could have some more questions, or I can always tell stories. I could tell you what happened at the paw when I got my skirt. Would you like me to tell you that story? Oh, maybe I can't go out there. Oh, I could. Well, just because the skirt is kind of pivotal in the story, I'll stand here. So one of the things I did when I was writing and compelled to understand myself a bit more was I contacted some of the people I had worked with in the communities in the north and also in Williams Lake in the Indigenous communities. And one of the places was in Moose Lake. And so the woman that gave me this ribbon skirt, I had written a story about her mom, Annie, and her son, Lyle, had been removed from their home community and taken to a medical services foster home. I don't know if any of you would know about that history. And often, because of the north and the remoteness of it, you couldn't get medical care. So he was taken from Moose Lake to Winnipeg. And when I began working for Indian Affairs, you know, the really bright young social worker that was going to fix everything, Annie came to me and asked me if I could help her find her son. She had no idea where he was. No one had kept in touch with her. She knew he'd gone for medical reasons, and he did have a medical condition, but they had provided no arrangements for her to go to Winnipeg and see him, and she'd lost touch. It was a pretty horrible story. So I went looking for him, and while that was happening, her daughter, Annie, who was 4 at the time, came along to several of the meetings. When I went back to the paw with my book just recently, Annie came to my book blessing. Can you believe it? She walked in. I didn't remember her, what she looked like exactly, but I was pretty sure it was her. And we hadn't seen each other for, 50 years at least. So she came in with this ribbon skirt for me, and there were lots of tears. The rest of the story is that I had been invited by the knowledge keeper at the paw, Edwin, the one that called me guilty Sandra, to have something called a book blessing. I didn't know what that was. Anybody heard of a book blessing? I mean, perhaps it's familiar to others, but it wasn't to me. And I said, sure, that's great. What do I do? So the community, Edwin, and the community at Opaskwayak Cree Nation arranged this book blessing, separate from a book launch. So it was at noon, and I provided a luncheon, and we invited people. The launch was public, little notice in the newspaper, and me wondering, will anyone come? But the book blessing I invited people to because we had lunch and all that. So when we were doing the invites, we invited the chief and council from the Paw Reserve, and the mayor and council from the town, and a few others in my family. Some of my family were there, and Annie was there, and there were prayers for her brother who had only recently died, the boy that we found. His name was Lyle. And by the way, any of the stories I tell you about, I have consent. And that was part of, in the writing, that's what brought me to people's, to be in touch with people, is I needed their consent. I wouldn't have written without it. But then I got more than consent. I got, you know, kind of wonderful responses. So I'm just going to get my water. Oh, good. I did know what I was doing. I just didn't remember. So we had the book blessing, which I could tell you more about, but this other piece just astonished me. Chief and council were there. The mayor and councillors, none of them came. But other people came, which was good, and we had a lovely ceremony and smudging and prayers. Many elders were there to support me. And the book blessing was over in about an hour and a half. And then, do they want to be part of the party? Oh, they have to go away? Oh, I see. Okay. So we were cleaning up, and I was packing the books up to put back in the car so I could take them to the college. That's where I was having the book launch that night. And, you know, I'd met the chief and counselor, and I knew a few of them, but I didn't know them well. And the chief was newly elected maybe a week prior, and she was the first female chief of the Pas Reserve, which is fabulous. I didn't know her or her family, but she came to the blessing. So the room's empty except for two girlfriends of mine who were going to help carry books. My husband had gone for a drive somewhere, and in walked the chief and came up to me and said, "I'd like you to come to our meeting." And I said, "What meeting?" And she said, "Well, a council meeting, we're right across the hallway." I had no idea that they were, chief and council were meeting across the hall. So I had maybe 30 seconds, and she took my arm, and I walked across the hallway. I had no idea what this was about, and I certainly didn't expect to be invited to a chief and council meeting. Got in the room, and the chief said, Maureen Brown is her name, "We would like you to talk to us about what it's like to be white and grow up in the Pas." Now, it seems to me that when I heard that, I thought, I've spent all this time trying to figure out what it's like to be Indigenous, to see through their eyes. Now, she wanted me to talk about what it was like to be white. So that you know, was a little bit surprising, but because I'd written the book and I'd written some hard truths about myself, I talked about some of those. And I talked about the murder and about things that happened around the murder that were not, they were brutal for me. I talked about doing nothing related to the murder, even though I knew by hearsay who the accused were. I knew their names, knew their families, but I didn't go to the police. And then I decided to talk about having been involved in residential schools and removing children. And as I looked out at, we were in a bit of a horseshoe kind of like this, and as I looked out at the people and told them the story about working for Indian Affairs and having been involved in removing children to residential school, it hit me that these people sitting there were the relatives and families of people whose children I had removed. And I couldn't talk. I began to weep. And I knew all their names. I mean, they'd introduced themselves to me, and I know the names from OCN. because of my work and because I lived there. And I was, as I started to cry, I knew I had to say I was sorry, because I knew I had affected these families. I didn't know how. I didn't exactly know how they were related to people I'd worked with, but I knew they were involved somehow. So I apologized and said I was sorry for what had happened at Indian Affairs when I was a social worker there, and what had unfolded in the residential schools. And of course, I didn't know, but it didn't seem that those words were very effective. I don't know, didn't really come into my mind. It was, I'm sorry. And what happened was not right and not fair. So somehow I said those words and stood weeping in front of Chief and Council and the elders. And what I'll never forget, the whole meeting I won't forget, but what I'll remember forever is the touch of the chief on my arm. She came up and said, "We accept your apology." And then no one spoke for a while. I wasn't the only one crying. You know, in the hearings that I was part of on behalf of our church, not once did I apologize without the claimants thanking me. Like I just found that I was overwhelmingly grateful, but I found the graciousness of their hearts was like to thank me was more than I expected. Our church being complicit in it, of course, was clear, but to have the claimants say thank you was just another piece, I guess, of healing for everybody. So I hardly recommend apologizing. It helps with my healing anyway. So the meeting of Chief and Council will forever be etched in me because it was totally unexpected. And I have no idea. I mean, I think Chief and Council, they had met in the morning. They'd all come for lunch and been part of the ceremony. And then they went, I didn't know they were across the hallway having a meeting. And I mean, I don't think I was on their agenda at the beginning of the morning. So maybe at the book blessing, the chief, I mean, I spoke a little bit about the book and, you know, the things that I had done and that I was not proud of. I don't know, I guess she got an idea of what I was talking about, and maybe then she changed the agenda. I have no idea, I'll never know. I just know that there was generosity and forgiveness in that room, and that it is not different than all of Canada. And I think that the journey of reconciliation is an urgent one for Canada. And it includes not only Indigenous and Métis and Inuit people, it includes the wideness that Tracy talked about here, the wideness of all peoples and all genders and all shapes and sizes and all languages. And I thank you for your courage in listening to me. I don't think it's a small thing to hear sad stuff. And I don't think it's a small thing that you've stayed for lunch and some descriptions of what it is I've written about. So thank you. I think we'll adjourn, unless, is there something you might want to say, Elaine? I think we're now, right? Yeah. Maybe nothing else to say, but whatever you want.
I just wanted to on behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for coming to share your story. It's an important one, and you need to be listened to. It's an important story to share. So Richard's going to be looking after if anyone's interested in picking up a copy of Sandra's book. And otherwise, I guess you'll be here for a few minutes for some questions.
Yeah, I'll be here for a few minutes, and I was going to say that if you are interested or you know anyone that would like me to come and speak about this, it feels important to me, and that I pretty much say yes to, well, just about everything. And I do it as a volunteer. I don't expect an honorarium or any kind of remuneration. So I've been to a few book clubs. They're really interesting. And I think there are some book club people here, am I right? Yeah. And so it's really lovely to be in a group of people who have open hearts, and so I'm willing to do more of that as time goes on. Thanks.